The way things are, from a couple of years on, things are real horrible here in New York, all over.
You're dealing with a lot of people that are maniacs today.
You're dealing with an individual who's very basic, who only knows two things: rip off or be ripped off.
Many of those who make good by being bad are nowhere to be seen these days.
I'd be afraid. Of course I'd be afraid. He's a sick guy. He'd kill any time.
Yeah, but listen.
There isn't anything on earth that I will hide from or back up from.
People seem not to understand the close relationship between organized crime and street crime. And certainly in dealing with street crime in his area or any other kind of crime, the uniform patrol...
Presenzano, shot 4 times, his throat cut. Presenzano was allegedly connected.
On March 9th, 2005, Louis Eppolito and his old NYPD robbery squad partner Stephen Caracappa would be arrested at their Las Vegas homes. They were accused of being contract killers for the Lucchese crime family, known as Anthony Gaspipe Casso's Crystal Ball. Their trial would last almost 4 years, and on March 6, 2009, they would both be sentenced to life in prison and fined millions of dollars. They were convicted of planning and or taking part in as many as 8 murders, amongst other charges. In turn, New York City would spend the next decade paying out a total of $18.4 million to families who were directly affected by the exploits of Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. In today's upload, we will discuss the life of one of these men, that man being Louis Eppolito. We will talk not about his hidden life as a contract killer, but rather his early life beginnings, his life on the force, and how the inner workings of his family may have contributed to his legacy. A legacy as one of the most heinous men to ever wear a New York City police badge. This is Mafia Cop. Who was contract killer Louis Eppolito? In his own words. Louis John Eppolito was born July 22, 1948, in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, New York City, to parents Ralph and Tess Eppolito. Louis, along with his sister Pauline, would grow up amongst a large portion of family members in a building that his grandmother Philomena Mandolino owned at 660 Midwood Street. At 5 years old, Louis would become very sick. His joints swelled up and his ability to walk would become greatly affected. His parents also took notice of his lack of growth compared to other children his age. At first, he received a polio diagnosis, but after a second opinion, he would be diagnosed with rheumatic fever, which affected one of his heart valves. Due to this, Louis would be confined to a wheelchair for 6 months with little to no activity. When 6 months were up, his heart health improved and he was sprung from his wheelchair. Unfortunately, he would have to learn to walk again. In Louis Eppolito's book Mafia Cop, which he co-authored with Bob Drury, he would speak a lot about his family life and coming of age in 1950s Brooklyn. Most importantly, he would speak about his relationship with his father, Ralph Eppolito. As a kid, he didn't know much about his father's occupation, only that he was a bartender, and had sometimes disappeared for days at a time. Throughout his childhood, Louis's father would teach him many life lessons. Unfortunately, many of these lessons came in the form of beatings. Louis Eppolito would state, quote, "I'd get smacked for looking the wrong way at my mother. I'd get smacked for using the wrong tone of voice with my sister. I'd get smacked for being 30 seconds late for dinner. And I'm not talking about love taps. My old man would wail the shit out of me at the drop of a hat, with his fists or whatever was handy nearby. You name a kitchen utensil, I'll guarantee it's been bounced off my forehead. He just missed me once with a bottle of ketchup. And you don't know how evil a loaf of Italian bread can be until you felt it slammed across your face." End quote. It would be through these lessons, and what he referred to as a peculiar sense of respect his father demanded, that Louis would develop a code of ethics that he would carry with him throughout his life. At around 12 years old, Louis Eppolito would start developing a clearer sense of what his father's occupation was, as well as some of his immediate family's occupations. It would begin at the Grand Mark Tavern, commonly referred to as the Grand Mark Social Club today. The tavern sat at the intersection of St. Mark's and Grand Avenue, in the Prospect Heights section of Brooklyn. It would be here that his father worked his so-called bartender job. However, the Grand Mark served more as one of the headquarters for the criminal operations of his father Ralph Eppolito, his uncle Fred, Big Freddie Eppolito, and his other uncle James, Jimmy the Clam Eppolito. Louis Eppolito would say that the brothers ran illegal gambling operations above the Grand Mark, as well as a loft across the street from the tavern. All three men had criminal records and ties to Albert Anastasia, ultimately becoming soldiers in the Gambino crime family. They made big money on craps games, card games, bookmaking, numbers operations, and if called for, were willing to take someone's life. In fact, a couple of years prior to Louis Eppolito's exposure to his father's real life, his father, as well as his uncles James and Alfred, would be brought in and questioned by authorities under suspicion of homicide. On September 7, 1958, the bullet-ridden body of mobster and mortician John Robilato, a.k.a. John Roberts, would turn up on Utica Avenue in Brooklyn. The made man and former close associate of Albert Anastasia was once charged with the murder of Genovese underboss Willie Moretti in 1951. However, he would get off on the murder of Moretti. Later in 1963, Joe Valachi would say that he in fact was one of the killers of Moretti. After Robilato's death, the Eppolito brothers were questioned on the murder due to witness testimony. The three Eppolito brothers were never charged with anything in relation to it. But that didn't stop Louis Eppolito from writing this in his 1992 book, Mafia Cop. Accompanied by a picture of his father Ralph and his uncle James are the words, "The last thing turncoat Gambino soldier John Robilato saw before being whacked was the faces of his hitmen. Louis's dad, Ralph, Fat the Gangster Eppolito left, and his uncle Jimmy, the Clam Eppolito." Furthermore, Louis would state that his father once had a conversation with him about being a part of the life and taking a blood oath for the organization, after he and his brother James killed a rat for the family, thus enabling them to get made, most likely alluding to the murder of one John Robilato. As far as Lou's time at the Grand Mark went, he would describe the location as having a members-only aura. Strangers would be looked at funny, but there was a local clientele that would come in for drinks. At 12 years old, he would start setting up crap tables in the apartment above the Grand Mark, and also watch as numerous wise guys funneled in to play zigonette, which Louis describes as an Italian version of baccarat. His young eyes would watch thousands of dollars changing hands throughout the day. Louis Eppolito also claimed that he would be tasked with paying off the local cops from the 80th Precinct. Cops would park outside the Grand Mark, pretending to be busy. However, they were just looking for a payday. Ralph Eppolito would hand 12-year-old Lou an envelope, and he would say, "Here's the money. Go give it to those bloodsuckers." Louis would run outside and slip the envelope to the awaiting officers. As a young teen, Louis was being exposed to a life very few children would see. He was surely taking notes. All that information, filing perfectly into his so-called code of ethics. In August of 1963, Lou's uncle, Alfred Eppolito, would be arrested for his role in a heroin trafficking ring. At the time of Eppolito's arrest, Assistant U.S. Attorney William Tendy would tell the press that Alfred was a loan shark, a jukebox operator, a dope wheel, and he's been suspected in numerous murders. Louis Eppolito would explain in his book Mafia Cop that after this pinch, his uncle Freddie was in big trouble with the Gambinos, and he was not long for this world. There was also rumors swirling around about his uncle Alfred vying for more power within the Gambino crime family. Alfred would never get whacked, because according to Lou, he hid out at home and drank himself to death before that could happen. At 15 years old, Louis Eppolito lost his uncle. He became a victim of his own crooked lifestyle. In June of 1966, Lou would graduate from Erasmus Hall High School in Brooklyn. The following year, he would get married to a woman named Teresa. They would have one child and name him Louis Eppolito Jr. After being rejected by the U.S. Army due to his heart condition, Lou took up employment at a local pet shop, pondering exactly where his life was going to go. In March of 1968, Louis Eppolito's father, Ralph, would pass away. He would die in his sleep. Louis would say that his father's funeral procession would be accompanied by FBI agents, looking on as the hearse made its way down Flatbush Avenue. Inside the funeral parlor, a number of big shots would make an appearance to pay respects to Ralph Eppolito, starting with the Godfather himself, Carlo Gambino. Others included Gambino consigliere Joanne Gallo and Genovese capo Tato Marino. The only family connection to organized crime Louis had left was his uncle Jimmy, the Clam Eppolito, a man whose power and reputation would grow in the coming years. In August of that same year, Louis Eppolito had made a career choice. He was going to take a shot at becoming a New York City police officer. Definitely an odd choice considering his background, but he went for it. Despite the police department learning about his organized crime family during his interview, they would still let him on the force. In Louis's mind, it didn't hurt that his father and his uncle Freddie were dead, and that he had a clean criminal record. He would spend 6 months in the academy before arriving at the 63rd Precinct in Marine Park, Brooklyn. He would partner up with Officer Lou Pioli. The following year in 1969, Louis would get divorced from his wife Teresa. Lou would speak about his time at the 63rd Precinct as being very productive. He made numerous arrests of drug dealers, muggers, burglars, and started building himself a reputation as a productive, hard-nosed police officer. He was also a big man at that time, and into bodybuilding, claiming to have won the Mr. New York City title and the Mr. East Coast title. However, some of the stories Louis would tell about his early years as a cop came off a bit disturbing to me. In one instance, he spoke about arriving to a home where a husband was suspected of beating his wife. After being upset about the violence that was going on in the home, he devised a plan to get back at the husband. He would sneak into the backyard of the home at night and rattle the garbage pails. When the husband came out to see what was going on, Louis beat the crap out of him. Lou would also talk about his promiscuous behavior at this time. He was now divorced, and from what I could tell, turning into a depraved sexual deviant who used his badge for favors. For example, he spoke about having sexual encounters with women in patrol cars, while his partner would be out picking up food at a diner. He also spoke about visiting the homes of battered wives in order to have sexual relationships with them. In his mind, they were the most vulnerable. He would say, quote, "Every time we went on a call where a husband smacked his wife, I went back that night and smacked it to her too." End quote. Louis was turning into a crazed vigilante cop, doing what he felt was right and taking matters into his own hands, rather than what was in the police handbook. Perhaps he was following the code of ethics handed to him by his mobbed-up father. March 1972. Louis would get out of the 63rd Precinct and make his way to East Harlem's 25th Precinct. It was a place that was a lot more violent and dangerous. Lou would get into numerous gun battles during his time in Harlem, on 2 occasions taking a perpetrator's life. One of those times resulting in him being nominated for a Medal of Honor and receiving a Medal of Commendation at a city ceremony. It would be around this time that Louis would remarry. He would meet his new wife, Fran, on a trip to Puerto Rico, and they would plan to elope just 6 months after meeting. Lou would have to put his deviant behavior behind him in order to have a successful marriage. And successful it was. Louis would go on to father 3 children with Fran: Tony, Deanna, and Andrea. In 1973, Eppolito would be transferred back to Brooklyn and work in the 71st Precinct. He was back in Brooklyn, but still servicing a rough part of town. The 7-1 encompassed neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. He would partner up with police officer James McCafferty. Once again, he would become a very active police officer and continue to grow his reputation, even picking up the nickname Atlas due to his size. His exploits would hit the newspapers often. In 1977, vigilante cop extraordinaire Louis Eppolito would make detective. He would work in a team known as the Undercover Senior Citizens Robbery Squad. Here we have a daily news article dating back to Monday, February 21st, 1977. The headline reads, "Decoy cops dressed the part to protect aged and infirm." The detectives on this squad would pose as senior citizens and walk the streets trying to bait criminals into mugging them. In another article just a couple of months later, New York City would get a behind-the-scenes look at the robbery squad. Here you see Louis Eppolito and his fellow detectives getting makeup, wigs, and senior citizen garb before hitting the streets. Ultimately, the senior citizen robbery squad would be dissolved, and members of the detective squad would form the Brooklyn Armed Robbery Squad. This is where in 1979, Louis Eppolito would partner up with a detective that he would be attached to forever in the annals of American criminal history, Stephen Caracappa. He's a man Louis Eppolito would refer to as his closest and dearest friend. This dynamic duo would hit the streets, and Louis would continue on his brand of street justice. In one instance, they would grab a man known as Bugs and bring him back to the precinct. Bugs was affiliated with a team of robbers known as the Disco Squad. After some wise words from Bugs, Louis went into full vigilante mode. Louis described this incident saying, quote, "I must have punched Bugs 40 times in the head, but he wasn't talking. This guy wore out my arms. My hands were swollen, and he just sneered. Finally, I took him into the back room and filled a bucket with the hottest water I could find. I emptied a half a jug of ammonia into the bucket. I couldn't even put my face near it without my eyes burning. Then I grabbed Bugs' head, and I dunked. He came up screaming. His face was mutating into a giant purple blotch. But when he caught his breath, he turned to me and told me to fuck off. So I dunked him again, and again. I've always been known for my balls, Bugs said to me. I couldn't disagree." End quote. Once again, truly deranged tactics from a man who at that time was a decorated officer of the law. In October of 1979, things would take a turn for Eppolito. He had experienced pain and loss in his life before, but nothing prepared him for the coming grief. October 1st, 1979. James Eppolito, capo in the Gambino crime family, arrives to the curb at Brighton 6th Street and Shore Parkway. He's in the back seat of his white 1978 Ford Thunderbird. In tow are his son James Jr. at the wheel, Gambino capo Nino Gaggi in the passenger seat, and next to him in the back are Roy DeMeo and longtime pal Peter Pacente. Tonight's meeting will result in James Jr. and James Sr. Eppolito getting their faces blown off right there on 6th Street, inside their 1978 Thunderbird. The fallout from this incident would be monumental for Nino Gaggi, Roy DeMeo, and Peter Pacente. However, Louis Eppolito, the veteran NYPD detective, would have to deal with it in other ways. On the night of his uncle and cousin's homicide, Louis Eppolito was working as one of Pope John Paul II's bodyguards. The Pope was visiting New York City, and the city was ripe with excitement, and of course chock full of security. Louis would say that just being next to the Pope was a gift. To him, the Pope was, quote, Christ on earth. Upon hearing of his uncle and cousin's homicide later that night, he would fly into a rage. He would hear of Nino Gaggi and Pacente's arrests, and of course he knew both of them very well, particularly Peter Pacente, who went back decades with his family as a close confidant of his father and uncles. He would make his way to the morgue and later tell us exactly what he saw that night. He would say, quote, "It was difficult, but I went over to the sheets they had spread over two bodies. I read the two toe tags. The first read James Eppolito Jr. When I pulled back the sheet, Jim's head was a mess. It was nothing I hadn't seen before in 12 years on the job, but all that blood and Jim's brain blasted away. It really upset me. Then I went to the old man. I don't know how I managed to pull his sheet away, but I did. Uncle Jimmy's face was just absolutely destroyed. His jaw and bottom lip were totally gone, torn off, giving him this long bucktooth look. And he had tattoos, the gunpowder marks that are left when you're shot at close range, all over what was left of his head. I cleaned him as best as I could, combing his hair and washing the blood off his face, but water kept pouring out his eyes like he was crying. I asked the morgue attendant if there was something that could be done about that, and I turned away. As I walked out, I saw the morgue guy with a washcloth, wiping what was left of Uncle Jimmy's cheeks." End quote. In the aftermath, Louis would claim that due to the incident, he would be personally summoned by Gambino boss Paul Castellano for a meeting. He said he would be picked up by a few men in a Cadillac and taken to Castellano's Todd Hill White House. Inside, he would be greeted by Tommy Bilotti, who would lead him to Big Paul. In short, Paul Castellano would explain that he had a lot of respect for Lewis and his family, and didn't want to see anyone else get hurt over this matter. They would both shake hands and agree that it would all end right there. Now, whether that story is true or not is to be debated, I suppose. However, the truth is, after the deaths of his uncle and cousin, Lewis would change forever. But rather than me tell you, let's once again go back to Louis Eppolito and Bob Drury's 1992 book, Mafia Cop, and see what his wife Fran, who contributed to the book, had to say about Louis' character at that time. Fran Eppolito. I saw changes in Louis after Uncle Jimmy died. He went through a long period of mourning, and I started to get scared that he was going to get involved. I begged him to stay out of it. I knew what was in his blood, and I knew how hurt he was. But from that day on, Louis was a different person. It was like now he had a little more pride in what his uncle was. Maybe Uncle Jimmy's death and hearing what cops were saying about him behind his back made Louis stand up a little taller. He wasn't ashamed of his family background any longer. He never apologized for it. If anything, he would brag about it to his friends, that my uncle was this and that sort of thing. Then I noticed that he began picking up some Italian mannerisms that he never had before. Before Uncle Jimmy's murder, I didn't oversee what you would call an Italian household. Louis didn't drink that black coffee they all drank. God, he even hated the smell of it on my breath when we kissed. Now suddenly I was being told to make him a cup of espresso, or to put some wine out on the kitchen table, huh? I mean, when Stephen Caracappa came over, you'd think there were two godfathers sitting at our kitchen table. The talking with the hands, the drinking of the double espressos, saluting each other to death after every sip. And now Louis was starting to kiss everybody on the cheek. Before he just kissed the family and shake hands with anyone else. Now it was Kiss City. End quote. The world didn't know it yet, but these words spoken by Fran Eppolito provided some haunting foreshadowing. The following year in 1980, Lewis would end up on the homicide squad in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn's 62nd precinct. He was in familiar territory. Familiar in the sense that he was amongst many of the organized crime characters he knew for many years, and in an area where many of the residents shared his heritage. It will be while working in the 6-2 that Louis would end up in deep shit. In 1984, Louis Eppolito would almost see his downfall. His new persona, and his years of practicing street justice, were finally catching up to him. Louis Eppolito would be suspended from the NYPD after finding himself at the center of an internal affairs investigation. Eppolito would be accused of passing confidential police files to Sicilian Gambino crime family heroin trafficker Rosario Gambino. Daily News, November 28th, 1984. Cops suspended in passing data to heroin figure. Veteran Detective Louis Eppolito was suspended yesterday after being accused by the police department of passing confidential police intelligence reports to a reputed mobster who was convicted last month as a major heroin trafficker. Authorities said Eppolito, who was assigned to the Bath Avenue station in Brooklyn, allegedly made photocopies last December of the intelligence files on Sicilian Mafia figure Rosario Gambino, while Gambino was under federal investigation. Eppolito, 36, a decorated 15-year veteran, was slapped with departmental charges, including misappropriation of files. He was suspended without pay and could face dismissal. Louis Eppolito would have a long battle ahead of him. Of course, it didn't help that Louis's family roots were in organized crime, and he had built himself a tough guy reputation. But some of the sentiment from his fellow officers didn't help either. Many at that time pondering whether Louis was walking a thin line between cop and criminal. Eppolito would admit himself that he was known for visiting with the likes of Gambino Capo Carmine Lombardozzi and palling around with Genovese Capo Tata Marino, amongst other well-known mafiosi in Brooklyn. The truth is, Louis seemed to know too much and know too many people. In the weeks prior to being accused of passing files to Rosario Gambino, he was seen by detectives Kenny McCabe and Frank Pergola messing around with Rosario Gambino outside of Cafe Italia in Bensonhurst. Pergola and McCabe would explain to Eppolito that he was now caught on surveillance and that his actions were a bad look. He would just brush him off. arrogant Louis Eppolito, staying true to his character. The Internal Affairs Division revealed that Eppolito did in fact have possession of the Gambino files at some point, but they needed more to nail Louis. Eppolito claimed that he initially came in contact with the Gambino folder when he received it from Detective Bill Sweeney. In November of 1984, he would sit in front of NYPD's Internal Affairs on Hudson Street in Manhattan. The purpose of the hearing was to question Louis as to why copies of Rosario Gambino's police files were found in Gambino's home. Deputy Inspector Robert McCormick would quiz Louis on the matter. I will read some of that transcript now. Deputy Inspector McCormick and Louis Eppolito, November 1984. Deputy Inspector McCormick. So Detective Sweeney gave you this information, gave you that material, gave it to you in a folder, is that correct? Detective Eppolito. Correct. All right. Now what did you do with it? I brought it back to the precinct, put it in a file marked Gambino, file 12-1283. That's all? Yes. Did you ever use it again? Did you ever add anything to it? I added this piece of paper the day that I saw it in the newspaper. Let the record reflect that he's showing an article entitled Gambino Convicted. You added that last Tuesday? Yes. Did you ever add anything else between the time you got it and last Tuesday? To the best of my knowledge, never. You never touched it? At all? Right. I just want to get this clear. You got it from Intel. Apparently it was their file. You brought it back to the 6-2 PDU. I made a folder. Made a folder and put the Gambino material in the folder? Yes. Put it in a filing cabinet and never touched it again until last Tuesday when you added that article. Did you ever make copies of that folder? None whatsoever. All right, Detective. Then how do you explain the fact that on March 16th, 1984, copies of exactly what you have there in front of you were recovered by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney while executing a search warrant at Rosario Gambino's residence in Cherry Hill, New Jersey? Can you think of any reason why that should have gotten out there? Do you have any idea of how it was out there at all? Can you, in your experience as a detective, think of any reason how it might have gotten there? Okay, well, did you make a copy of the material? Not once. Not once, so you didn't make a copy. No, I did not make a copy of that material. All right. Would it interest you to know that the copies that were found in Gambino's house were run off according to laboratory analysis from the precinct copy machine in the 6-2? Do you have any explanation for that at all? Louis Eppolito would go quiet. Detective, I have one more question. Surely. The laboratory analysis of the material that was found in the Gambino house, the copies of the information that was from the 6-2 PDU, also have your fingerprints on it. Can you tell me how those fingerprints got there? Do you have any idea at all? Investigators would also say that a call was made from an Atlantic City payphone to Rosario Gambino's home, and on that same Atlantic City payphone, a call was made to Louis Eppolito's place of employment, the 62 precinct in Brooklyn. Louis claimed that he never even visited Atlantic City. In a last-ditch effort by investigators going after Louis, they would play a recording of two mobsters caught on the wire, around the time Louis was accused. The mobsters on the recording spoke about their crooked NYPD spy not being able to help them at the moment because he was in trouble. Louis Eppolito would stick by his story all the way through the investigation. He simply had no idea how the copied files got into the hands of a mobster. Furthermore, he claimed that he never, ever made a copy of the files for himself. In April of 1985, Lou Eppolito would get off. He would be able to keep his job and try to recuperate his reputation. Investigators were not able to prove Louis was responsible for putting the copied files in Rosario Gambino's hands. Plus, on the original files, other fingerprints not belonging to Louis were found. And the copies found in Rosario Gambino's home didn't have an original print on it, but only a copy of Louis's fingerprints. In the end, there was something missing. Despite Louis's wise guy persona, his family history, and the whispers from other NYPD detectives, investigators didn't have the final nail to hammer Louis for good. The entire saga takes up numerous chapters in his 1992 book, Mafia Cop. It's a part of a section of the book titled Betrayal, because I suppose he felt the NYPD were betraying him in their investigation. To me, the whole thing stunk, and knowing what we know about Louis now, It doesn't surprise me at all. Perhaps the oddest tidbit Louis supplies in his book is that before being under investigation for leaking information to Rosario Gambino, Eppolito admitted that he asked Detective Sweeney about who was working on the Gambino case, and he told Sweeney where Gambino hung out, and that the feds had bad information on him. It would be Lewis's soliciting of info from Sweeney and Lewis's intel that would seemingly plant the seed in Detective Sweeney's head. That seed being get Lewis involved in the Rosario Gambino case. Now one could take this as Louis just being inquisitive, but once again, knowing who Louis Eppolito is today, is it odd to assume he intentionally planted these seeds in order to gain intelligence on Rosario Gambino that he can use for his and the mob's advantage? In my opinion, no. When it was over, Lewis got transferred to the 63rd Precinct and filed a $5 million lawsuit against New York City. The suit was thrown out. In 1989, Louis Eppolito would retire from the force, just a year after making second-grade detective. He would describe his retirement saying, quote, "The New York City Police Department has finally managed to rid itself of one of its worthiest cops." In the coming years, Louis Eppolito would get into the entertainment business. He would appear as a hitman in the 1989 Kojak film Fatal Flaw. The following year, he would appear in the legendary Martin Scorsese film Goodfellas. In the classic scene where Ray Liotta runs down the names of the gangsters in his orbit, Lewis appears as Fat Andy. He would say that on set, he became very friendly with Robert De Niro, and even gave him some tips on how to be a wise guy. In 1992, Simon & Schuster would release a book co-authored by Louis Eppolito and Bob Drury. The book, titled Mafia Cop, the story of an honest cop whose family was the mob, tells of Lewis's life from his own accounts and by the accounts of others who were around him for many decades. In promoting the book, he would famously appear on an episode of Sally Jesse Raphael in 1992. He would talk about his mobbed-up family, his life on the force, and once again, some of his bizarre tactics.
I go down and I put a shotgun in his mouth in a club that's owned by Spiro in Brooklyn, big wise guy.
You would open someone's mouth and put a shotgun in?
I stuck it down his mouth.
He did.
And
He did?
I cocked the gun barrel and he wet himself. His stain was getting bigger and bigger.
Gee, I can't imagine why.
Although Lewis is on stage talking about being a cop, just observing him could lead you to believe that he had an affinity for the mob lifestyle. Observing him explain the tactics he would use on the street, looking at his jet black hair, his fancy suit, his gold watch, gold rings, and gold bracelets, is quite the sight. Never mind that in that appearance, he also stated his opinion that the government did John Gotti wrong in their persecution of him. But perhaps the biggest takeaway from the whole appearance would be from a woman in the audience, who, like Louis' wife Fran, provided what would prove to be some more haunting foreshadowing.
Lou, we reap what we sow in this life. How do you think your life's going to end?
Well, I'm going to make it end good. There's nobody in the world that can defeat me and my inner self. I'm very happy, and I'm very, very strong-minded. I never bow to people.
Do you have a conscience of what you've been doing? I mean, do you ever lose sleep at night?
Oh, no, not at all.
What did he do?
I did my job as best I can, as best I could.
Louis Eppolito would die at the age of 71 on November 3rd, 2019, at Tucson Medical Center in Arizona. At the time of his death, he was serving a life sentence in federal prison, 10 years earlier being convicted with Stephen Caracappa of numerous homicides for the Lucchese crime family. Him and Stephen, living on forever in infamy, as two of the most despicable characters to ever wear a badge. And with that, I hope you enjoyed today's upload. Thank you for watching NYC Crime Spot.